I was raised in a Pentecostal home, born in Mexico, migrated to the U.S., where I would go on circuits preaching the Word of God and trying to convert atheists to Christianity and Catholics to Christianity, because we didn't think, Catholics were Christians. But something happened along the way, and I thought, well, I'm going to have to be a missionary, and to be a missionary, you need to be a biblical scholar. You need to know the languages, and you need to know how to verify sources for yourself, because I started to see that what my minister would tell me was somehow different than what scientists told me about life in the universe. So in the end, after a few years of studying the Bible, and when people ask me, how did you become an atheist? I always tell them, well, Bible study made an atheist out of me. And that's the truth. By the end of my high school and the first year of my college experience, I was an atheist. And so now the problem was, what am I going to do for my profession? I can either be a Maytag repairman, or I can be a biblical scholar. And now, however, I'm going to be a biblical scholar from the other end. And so, having been a fundamentalist and a creationist, I now knew how to defeat the arguments of the fundamentalists. So I became a biblical scholar, went to Harvard Divinity School, where the joke is, of course, you have to be an atheist to get in. But I successfully completed the master's and went on to the PhD. And now I am a biblical scholar, an openly atheist biblical scholar. And what I have found is my profession, most of my colleagues in my profession, are not always telling their audiences what they would tell each other. So let me tell you what scholars know. Modern biblical scholarship has demonstrated that the Bible is the product of cultures whose values and belief about the origin, nature, and purpose of our world are no longer held to be relevant even by most Christians and Jews themselves. And this is what scholars tell each other. This is a report from the American Academy of Religion. It's the largest professional organization of scholars of religion in the world. And this is a report they put out in 1975, in which they said, indeed, one of the enduring contributions of biblical studies in this century, of course that's the 20th, has been the discovery of the strangeness of the thought forms of biblical literature of the Western tradition to us. They know that this book is alien. Once you know what it really says, and most people don't, you will see how odd these beliefs that this book espouses. And what do I mean by irrelevant? Well, I mean a biblical concept or practice that is no longer viewed as valuable, applicable, or ethical. Ethical is a key word. Let's take some of these examples. Disease today is not due to supernatural agents as it is in the Bible. I go to the hospital, I am not asked what demon I have. I am asked what my symptoms are. The killing of women and children was sometimes endorsed by these biblical authors. We no longer think, most of us at least, think that's moral or ethical. The sky is made out of metal in the Bible. Most people don't realize that in Genesis 1, the Hebrew word rakia really refers to a metal solid object up in the sky. And so people are not even reading Genesis 1 quite well, and we don't see a metal sky up there. People don't know what the Bible really says, and so they think it's still relevant. Women are generally inferior to men in the Bible. Well, most of us would think, no, women are at least equals. They can vote and do other things. That's not the biblical view for the most part. So a lot of specific concepts in the Bible that are thought to be biblical are no longer held to be relevant even by Christians and Jews themselves. Now, biblical scholars, though, want to still create the illusion of relevance. Well, what purposes does that serve, you say? Well, their self-employment, for one. If there's no Bible, there is no biblical scholarship. If there's no biblical scholarship, there's no paycheck. Now, I don't want to say that's why they do it, but I'm saying that's certainly one of the functions of keeping biblical scholarship alive. So how do they do this? How do they convince you that an irrelevant book is really relevant? Well, they have a variety of scholarly disciplines whose methods and conclusions are often philosophically flawed. This includes translation of the Bible, textual criticism, trying to reconstruct the original text, archaeology, history, and so forth. Then there is an infrastructure that supports this discipline. That includes universities, that includes a media publishing complex, and of course churches. So when I say it's not atheists saying the Bible is irrelevant, it is Christian biblical scholars saying that. I am not lying to you. Look at John Bright. He is one of the most respected biblical scholars of the 20th century, a Christian. Some would say somewhat of a conservative, on the conservative side of critical scholarship. And he's talking about Leviticus 25, which talks about all these arcane agricultural regulations. He says this: the regulations described therein are obviously little applicable to the modern situation. And they are so inapplicable that a preacher might be pardoned if he told himself that the passage contains no relevant message for his people whatever. That's not an atheist saying that. Now this might qualify as an atheist, but even so, he tells us this: can biblical scholars, and this is Philip Davies of Sheffield University, he's one of the most prominent biblical scholars today. Can biblical scholars persuade others that they conduct a legitimate academic discipline? Until they do, can they convince anyone that they have something to offer to the intellectual life of modern world? Indeed, I think many of us have to convince ourselves first. And this is Michael Coogan, a Catholic biblical scholar, who talks about how it is that churches try to hide the bad parts of the Bible from their constituents. Conspicuously absent from the lectionary, this is the lecture, the readings that you do from week to week in a church, are most or all of such books as Joshua, with its violent extermination of the inhabitants of the land of Canaan at divine command, or Judges, with its horrifying narratives of patriarchy and even sexual assault, to say nothing of the Song of Solomon, with its charged eroticism. That's not an atheist saying that. And then when we have this proposal by Howard and Irvin Barad that deals with how do you deal with passages where it's severely anti-Jewish, where Jews are definitely seen as evil, how do you deal with it in modern Bibles? Well, they propose this. The solution to erasing this hatred is for Bible societies and religious publishers to produce 2 editions of the Bible. One for the public, similar to the contemporary English version, which reduces significantly this anti-Judaic potential, and the other edition for scholars, taken from the Greek text. The stakes are high. People have been murdered because of these words. You know what he's proposing here, right? Orwell, right? We'll give one to the masses, well, they don't know what's in there, and then we'll keep the one that we know what it really says, for those of us that know Greek, to ourselves. That's how they're keeping it relevant. Why don't they just say, let's get rid of this book if it's so murderous, if it can result in such violence? No, they don't want to do that. Sales of Bibles would go down, you see. Employment checks would cease. Well, I promised to talk to you about how archaeology has been used to keep the Bible relevant. Archaeology, of course, is dedicated to reconstructing the past through material remains. And actually, that's what I was first trained in as an anthropologist, an archaeologist. And archaeology, at least in the biblical archaeology sense, began with the purpose of maintaining the relevance of the Bible by seeking to confirm its historical accuracy. So once you said, see, now we have proven that the Bible is accurate over here, you can then extrapolate it to, now it's accurate about everything. Accurate about one thing, it's accurate about everything. And that would include the supernatural claims, that would include the ethical claims, and so forth. And so archaeology has been very important in keeping this text alive. So let me contrast the situation in 1900 with what's going on today. In 1900, most biblical scholars, not all, would tell you Genesis is historical and scientific. For the most part, it is. There was an Abraham. We can prove there was a Jacob in Egypt and so forth. And the Exodus really happened. We have evidence for the Exodus. We have evidence that David was king and Solomon had a kingdom, an empire that stretched from Egypt to Iraq today. And they would tell you all, we have plenty of evidence for Jesus as a historical character. That, by and large, would describe 1900. And chief among these academic biblical scholars is William F. Albright. He's probably the most influential biblical archaeologist of the 20th century. I hate to claim him for Iowa, but he was not from Minnesota. He was raised in Iowa, and sometimes it's called a crypto-fundamentalist, because even though he had an academic position at Johns Hopkins for most of his life, and he was skeptical of a lot of things in the Bible, he still thought most things we could tell are historical. But this is the situation in 2007. If you were to take a poll among biblical scholars in academia today, they would tell you, we don't regard Genesis as a scientific or historical text for the most part. We don't think that Exodus is mostly historical. There might be seeds of it, but we don't think as related in the Bible it is. There's no trace of David or Solomon from their time. And there's no trace of Jesus after centuries of searching in his supposed lifetime. And to illustrate this, let's look at what Ronald Hendel of UC Berkeley said. Biblical archaeology doesn't really exist today in the way it once did. It's gone. William G. Diver, Dean of Biblical Archaeology, says American Syro-Palestinian and biblical archaeology are moribund disciplines. And archaeologists like me, who have spent a lifetime in the profession, feel like the last members of an endangered species. Now, even so, Dever, who comes in for the greatest criticism in my chapter on archaeology in the Bible, still wants to retain, he still thinks there are still some things that are truly historical. And so, Dever fights for what little is left. But look how little is left, even with him. He said, with most scholars, I would exclude much of the Pentateuch, specifically the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Much of what is called the English Bible poetry, wisdom, and devotional literature must also be eliminated from historical consideration. Ruth, Esther, Job, Daniel, historical novella with contrived real-life settings, the latter dating as late as the 2nd century BCE. Well, what's left? Well, what's left is really Samuel, Kings, Judges. That's where he thinks any history, if there is such a thing, is found. Well, what happened between 1900 and 2007? Well, first, you had the rise of science, which helped explain that the world was not created in 6 days. It took billions of years, and human beings were not created out of dirt. You have the rise of university-trained biblical scholars. So even some of the ones that did believe a lot of it started drifting away slowly. And then new discoveries in the ancient Near East showed that, well, we have the flood story already in Mesopotamia, we have a creation story in Mesopotamia, we have a lot of stuff that we thought only the Bible, only revelation from God would have told you, including some of the laws of Moses. We already have them in Mesopotamia before. So were they revealed to them too? Or, more likely the case, did the biblical authors simply adopt and adapt them? And let me look at some very specific examples of things that used to be thought as historical. The traditional date of the Israelite conquest, so right after Moses gets out of Egypt, almost gets into the Promised Land, but doesn't quite make it. We have this exodus of 1 to 2 million people crossing the desert, and now they're about to conquer Israel right around 1400 BC if you follow the traditional date. Well, that's a heck of a lot of people coming into a very small area. 1 to 2 million people. And what happened to that notion? Well, in 1887, we discovered this trove of correspondence between a king of Egypt named Akhenaten and kings all over Israel. and Syria, and what's now Turkey, and in what's now Iraq. And in this correspondence between King Akhenaten and these other towns, no mention of Israel as an entity. They don't know what that is. It's not there. This is 1375 BCE. There is no kingdom of Israel in 1375. In fact, the earliest mention we have is in the Merneptah stele, somewhere around 1210 BCE. So right there it tells you, whatever it is, these 1.2 million people that established this kingdom right around the time of Joshua, no trace of it in this correspondence. There should have been. We have this claim in 1 Kings 4:21 that Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates, which is in Iraq now, to the land of the Philistines, to the border of Egypt. They bought tribute to him and served Solomon all the days of his life. This is an enormous empire. In fact, there was no empire this large before around the 600s. But here it is. Solomon is dated around 1000 or so, 900s. And we have no trace of that in any extra-biblical literature. Now, where Deaver, who I said still wants to keep a little bit of history, said, I have an example where the Bible does confirm, or archaeology does confirm, a detail found in the Bible. And it is here in 1 Kings 9:15 through 19. Briefly it says, and this is the account of forced labor which King Solomon levied to build the house of the Lord and his own house, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. 3 towns in which he is said to have built something. And these towns have Hazor up there in the north, Megiddo up here, and then Gezer down here. And so, according to the Bible, he was a great builder. So, Deaver said, I think I have found those gates that Solomon built. He says, here they are. We have 3 very similar gates at Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer. They all have these 6 chambers, and they all seem to be constructed very similarly. Well, where else do we have 3 gates that might have been constructed so similarly? Well, maybe there's a centralized planner. And where do we find a centralized planner? Well, 1 Kings 9:15 said Solomon built walls at these 3 places. Therefore, these walls, these gates are Solomonic. See, the Bible is historically accurate. And he said so. He says the parallels between the 3 Solomonic gates alluded to in 1 Kings 9 and those brought to light by the excavations are so close that we must posit royal supervision in the construction of fortified provincial administrative centers in the 10th century, 900s. Here is a rare, dramatic instance of archaeology turning up actual structures mentioned specifically in the Bible. And then he said that these same soundings also revealed another casemated residence and proved that beneath the misdated offset inset wall, I won't get you into the technicalities of onset inset walls, lay the true wall corresponding to the Solomonic gate. So now he's used the word proof, proved, something that's very scientific. And Baruch Halpern, Penn State, sort of agreed with him. What is more, the major palace at 10th century Megiddo matches the Bible's description of the Jerusalem palace in 1 Kings 6 to a T. And now we've learned, and I'm going to show you how archaeologists often hyperbolize what is really very weak evidence. Let's start with the dating gate. How do we know that those gates were from the time of Solomon? Well, we don't. What you do is you say, well, those gates, there's biblical mentions of those towns, therefore they must be from the time of Solomon. It's a circular argument. Now, if you find pottery associated with those gates, then any other pottery you find anywhere else in Israel is going to be Solomonic. So it's a circular argument. Once you assume that this is from Solomon's time, anything else similar to that will be from Solomon's time. But by 1998, we see Dever retreat. Here he has a caption in which he says something like this. These three gates are now 9th century BCE gates at Megiddo, Hazor, Gezer, Ashdod, and Lachish. Now they're no longer 10th century. Now they're 9th. Now what happened to this proof? That they were from the 10th century, Solomon's time. And then in 2005 he retreats even further, and somewhat contradictorily. Thus I believe that while the Hazor and Megiddo gates might turn out to be 9th century, the Gezer gate will likely remain well fixed in the 10th century. Now notice, two of them he concedes, maybe 9th, but Gezer maybe, he still wants to keep that. Why? Why Gezer? That's where he dug. He wants that to be a Solomonic city. Well, what happened? Why did this sort of proof that he said was there come to its demise? Well, first of all, new radiocarbon dates in the 1990s cast doubt on 10th century BCE dates. Yes, not all have agreed that the radiocarbon dates are good. Some allege contamination, that kind of thing. But there are enough radiocarbon dates now to say, maybe not 10th century. And then Norma Franklin of Tel Aviv University went and looked at those layers again that had been assigned to Solomon's time. And she said, no, these layers have been misinterpreted completely. And walls that we thought were connected to the gates really are walls that belong to the next century. And so the gates, too, should be dated to the next century. And then we found mason's marks. Very precise marks, very individual marks, at a palace in Samaria, another city just south of Megiddo. And these mason marks, which come from a structure that everybody pretty much acknowledges is 9th century, are the same mason marks that are found in the Megiddo structures assigned to Solomon. So unless you have the same masons living for over 100 years, they cannot be from the time of Solomon. And now Gabriel Barkai, a major Israeli archaeologist, said this. Detailed examination of the gates, however, reveals that they are not identical, and that they are certainly not built according to a single blueprint designed by a central authority. Thus, the schematic and commonly held view regarding the homogeneity of the gates at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, and their attribution to Solomon in accordance with biblical passage no longer holds true. There goes the Solomonic gates. And so now the revised chronology would be something like this. This would be the layer assigned formerly to Solomon's time. Now it's assigned to Ahab's time. Ahab, that evil king that only did bad things. He became the greatest builder, actually, in Israel history, or one of them. So now everything has been dated, or is beginning to be dated downward 1 century later. But what that means is this. We're left with no 10th century in the archaeological record. And the 10th century is a time of David and Solomon. And when you look in Jerusalem for where is David's palace, where is this temple of Solomon, can't find it. Have not been able to find it. Oh yes, some people think it's under that, mosque, the Golden Dome, that area. Yeah, but where is it? We can't find it. Now some would say, well, it doesn't mean we won't. But what about the settlement, the rest of the settlement of this grandiose city that was supposed to be there? Can't find it. Well, maybe it's eroded away. Well, how come we find earlier stuff? But no, none from the 10th century. Why? So indeed, there are no proven remains from the 10th century in Jerusalem as of now. No mention of David or Solomon in any non-biblical record from their time. You will find correspondence to Solomon, from Solomon, like we do for every other king. Why not? He had an empire as big as the Assyrian Empire. And we have plenty of people sending the Assyrian king stuff where they have to keep receipts and all kinds of things. Nothing like that for Solomon. Nothing like that for David. Why is that? Well, the king of the revisionists is Israel Finkelstein from Tel Aviv University. And he's the one responsible for redating. He's also, of course, the arch enemy of Deaver. And, of course, now he says you can't use the Bible to confirm anything. You shouldn't be using it to look for archaeological evidence of anything. It is an unreliable record from a later period meant to glorify an earlier period. It's kind of like King Arthur, where, you had these Norman conquerors coming into England, and then they created this King Arthur character to keep the Saxons kind of happy that they had a past. So in this way, that's how David and Solomon are looked at now. These figures created by a later period and retrojected back, because archaeologically we can't find them. And let me tell you what's happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, one of the most monumental discoveries of all time. And here is, behind me there is Cave 4. Cave 4 is where the greatest number of scrolls were found. Hundreds and hundreds of books, texts we never knew were there. And what the Dead Sea Scrolls showed was that the Bible people were reading today is not necessarily the Bible they were reading then. Whole portions have been taken out, put in. Things don't say the same thing. We have a book of Jeremiah 1/8 shorter than what people are reading today. We have a story of David and Goliath, part of what you find in 1 Samuel 17, verses 12 to 31, gone, not there. So that leaves Christians with a big problem. Well, if there were many different texts of the Bible, how come you chose this one as God's inspired word? You could have chosen a dozen others. So it leaves them with a big theological problem that most Christians in church aren't told. And that's not the only problem. Now you have to deal with all the dozens of other books that people are apparently holding as authoritative that are no longer in your Bible. So what happened to Enoch, for example, in your Western Bibles? What happened to the Gospel of the Laodiceans, the Epistle to the Laodiceans, which was in Bibles for like 1,000 years? Gone. And of course we come to the big J. Jesus, of course, is the central character in the Christian Bible. And the first major assault on the historicity of Jesus was by this German named Reimarus, who was so scared he couldn't even say it with his own name when he wrote. So he wrote anonymously. And in it, he already gave us this wonderful theory that Jesus is mostly a myth about a failed revolutionary. And since Reimarus in 1768, not one single shred of evidence has come back from Jesus' time. Yes, you probably heard of the James Ossuary. This is supposed to be the earliest mention of Jesus in the archaeological record. There's a box which stores bones, and on it has an inscription. It's hard to see here, but it's right here. And for those of you that read Aramaic, I'm sure you understand what it says already. It says, James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Well, believers certainly flock to this as, well, here we have final proof that there was a Jesus in the first century. And so the Bible is now accurate in everything it says, right? Well, since then, of course, it's been declared, at least part of the inscription, to be a forgery by the Israel Antiquities Authority. Now, even if it were not a forgery, there were so many Josephs and Jesuses, actually. Jesus was a very common name. So it's like going to your local cemetery here in Minneapolis and finding someone that says, this is Paul, who is related to Peter. And then you say, oh, see, that's Paul and Peter of the New Testament. See, you got the two names. What is the statistical probability that you would have these two names that are linked in the Bible also appearing in a cemetery in Minneapolis? Well, maybe the body was moved to Minneapolis. You could come up with all kinds of apologetic explanations, right? Well, so even if you did have that inscription, it wouldn't tell you much. The fact that Jesus existed doesn't mean he was the Son of God or that he did any other miracles. It tells us nothing more than he was a human being. This is the actual earliest hard evidence for the New Testament we have. It's this little fragment called P52. And P52 is over in Manchester, England. It's from the 2nd century, maybe around 125 CE, if we can date it by the sheer paleography, the shape of the letters. Has not been carbon tested. And that's the earliest thing we have. We don't have anything from Jesus' time, around 30. We don't have anything like that. And then the other Gospels on which people depend for the life of Jesus, your Matthew and your Luke and your Mark, nothing until the 3rd century. You don't have any actual manuscripts until the 3rd and 4th centuries. And then when people say, well, but we have these Roman authors who did say there was such a person as Jesus. Well, yes, but you know what they don't tell you is that all of those manuscripts of those Roman authors are from the medieval period. So here we have a Jesus scholar, a major one, saying that. He buries it in a footnote. You have to wade through hundreds of pages to find that footnote. And he says, as with Josephus, so with Tacitus, our observations must be tempered by the fact that the earliest manuscript of the Acts comes from the 11th century. Why didn't you tell us that in the main text? You could have saved yourself, 1,000 pages of drivel. Because nothing else would matter. I mean, you don't know what they put in between, the year 1 and the year 1100 or 1000. You don't know what they took out or what they changed. Why are you using 11th century evidence for a 1st century person? So this is the sad reality of Jesus studies. There is a gap. Jesus lived around 30, and the oldest manuscript we have is from 125. And it doesn't even mention Jesus, by the way. That little scrap I showed you doesn't even have the word Jesus in it. Now, we can reasonably say it's there, but the fact is, we still don't have anything with Jesus in it, from the New Testament until like the 3rd century then. How do we know? How do we know what they put in here, what they took out? Well, we don't. But scholars, biblical scholars, for the most part, trying to pretend that they do when they can. Well, they can't. And so now Deaver has come over even more to the dark side. This is one of his latest exhalations. And he says, I wrote to frustrate biblical minimalists. Those are the people that believe there's only a minimal amount of history. Then I became one of them. Sort of, if you can't beat them, well, join them, right? So these are my conclusions. The Bible is not relevant to the modern world. People lived tens of thousands of years without the Bible. You don't need it. Most Christians don't even read the Bible, or they don't even know what's in it. Scholars need to focus on moving people beyond the book, not trying to keep it alive. And let me show you what I mean. In a 2005 Gallup poll, fewer than half of Americans can name the first book of the Bible. You get names like, Farewell to Arms? A 2006 university survey by Baylor said this: 21.9% of mainline Protestants and 33% of Catholics never read Scripture. So really, you see, the Bible is not really relevant in actuality. It's this myth that keeps it relevant, this idea that it should be relevant, that keeps it relevant.